Hello everyone, I'm Ben Mudge, and today we are going to be looking at the Constitution and economic development of Belarus. Belarus is a nation located on the eastern edge of Europe in between modern-day Poland and Russia. Belarus is a fairly young European nation as the basis for the nation was laid at the end of World War II with the defeat of Nazi Germany. The new nation, carved out of reconquered Russian land, was officially named the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. Belarus was set up as a People's Republic by the Soviet Union after the war, with Joseph Stalin personally writing key aspects of the constitution at the time, deliberately trying to keep communists in key positions of power. Before this point, the land that would become Belarus had never governed itself, as it was occupied by the Soviets and Poland for most of its history. The current nation of Belarus was founded on August 25, 1991, becoming the Republic of Belarus. Ironically, communist parties won the majority of seats in the new government during the first election cycle, resulting in a 3-year hiatus before the new constitution could be completed and implemented. In 1994, Belarus finally managed to approve their constitution. This new constitution made Belarus into a presidential democracy, putting the elected president as head of state instead of the prime minister. This constitution created a separation of powers similar to that of the United States, but it also gave the president much more power than its American counterpart, making this aspect more similar to the Russian Federation's constitution. Belarus's constitution separates the powers of state into a legislative, executive, and judicial branch, with similar structures to Western nations' branches of government. The legislative branch, now called Parliament, can write and approve legislation through its two houses, with the executive being able to veto or sign it into law. The judicial system can review legislation that was passed and examine it to see if it violated the Constitution. It then has the ability to revoke the passed law if it finds that it did violate Belarus's Constitution. While checks and balances do exist, the president of Belarus is granted a large amount of power, which makes it very easy to abuse. This happened with the first president elected in Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. Elected in 1994 as president, Alexander Lukashenko was very closely connected to the communist regime in Belarus and continued many of their authoritarian policies, including violent police and military crackdowns on protesters of his regime and policies. When Lukashenko's initial term was about to end in 1996, he initiated a constitutional referendum. And in this referendum, he voted to eliminate many of the checks and balances present in the Belarusian constitution in favor of new amendments written by him and his supporters. These new reforms on the constitution would allow Lukashenko to appoint 1/3 of all members of the Belarusian parliament, as well as allow him to rule through decree while extending his presidential term until at least 2004. Under the constitution, for constitutional reforms to pass, at least half of the voting age population had to show up to the polls to vote for the vote to be considered valid. Unsurprisingly, the reforms passed, with the Belarusian government saying 84% of the voting age population showed up to vote. These numbers have been disputed as false by many organizations, with most claiming closer to 50% of the voting age population actually showed up to vote. The vote, in general, was riddled with corruption, with the main election oversight agency being dismissed before the vote started, with the vote itself taking place over a period of 2 weeks, making any monitoring attempts much more difficult. Again, his term was extended with another referendum in 2004, with many similar claims of fraud and corruption. Throughout his reign, many protesters and journalists that spoke out against him and his regime were either jailed or beat by authorities. This resulted in growing resentment from many of the Belarusian people who had supported his rule previously. Finally, bowing to pressure, he allowed for an election to take place where he promised to leave office peacefully if he lost. He ended up winning the election, managing to stay in power despite the most resistance to his rule to date. Now that we've looked at the Constitution and how some of the powers afforded to the government were abused, we're going to be taking a look at the economics of Belarus to see how developed it is as an economy. Belarus is increasingly transitioning away from an industrial, production-based economy to that of a service-based economy, Belarus is classed as an upper to middle income economy, with a real GDP of the nation sitting around $184 billion in 2021. GDP per capita of Belarus is $19,800 a year, with just over half of the population participating in the service industry. Belarus has an odd assortment of top exports, with their top four being fertilizer, oil, cheese, and cars. The largest export of Belarus is potassic fertilizers, making up 7.58% of exports, with $15.8 billion worth going to Russia, who is their largest trading partner. Oil makes up the second largest export of Belarus, making up 7.53% of the total Belarusian exports for 2021. Cheese and vehicles, specifically delivery trucks, make up the third and fourth largest exports of Belarus. Cheese alone makes up 3.44% of total exports, with delivery trucks making up about 2.73%. All of these exports overwhelmingly go to one place, Russia. 45.7% of all Belarusian exports make their way over their shared border into Russia, with the next largest trading partner, at least in 2021, being Ukraine, who imported 13.7% of all Belarusian exports. Belarus is a large importer of crude oil, as they lack the natural reserves for large production, but possess the ability to refine crude oil into processed petroleum. 18.5% of total imports into Belarus are crude oil, representing a massive portion of imports in comparison to its other imports. Cars and vehicle parts make up the next largest percentage of imports, making up 3.26% of total imports. These are usually finished consumer cars produced in Western nations, as Belarus primarily produces delivery vehicles. Packaged medicine makes up its third largest percentage of imports, at 1.5% of total imports. Russia, unsurprisingly, is by far the largest exporter to Belarus, making up 54.5% of the products imported by Belarus. China ranks as the second largest trading partner to Belarus, with 9.42% of total imports coming from China. Poland, Germany, and Ukraine make up the next largest exporters to Belarus, but none of them make up over 5% of total imports. Due to Russia being far and away Belarus's largest trading partner, the Belarusian economy has taken a large step back both last year and this year due to the Ukraine war and sanctions placed on both Russia and Belarus. The economy is currently in a recession, with Lukashenko having the task of fixing the economy while staying close with Russia, which may prove near impossible while the Ukraine war continues. In conclusion, Belarus let its most recent chance at restarting the democracy slip away, with Lukashenko winning the last presidential vote in 2020. This has resulted in Belarus growing closer with Russia and supporting the war in Ukraine, with them also receiving sanctions for supporting the war. Their trade with Russia has also suffered, as Western sanctions on Russia have hurt Belarus, as Russian purchasing power is increasingly falling. The 2-year recession that Belarus is in is only seen to get worse as the year goes on, but there is a ray of hope. Presidential elections are slated to be held in 2025, which may allow other parties to come into power and rectify the alien situation of the country. And then there's my sources.